Great, yeah, so playing violin on the deck chair of the Titanic, the situation in the world with the crises that we're facing, and often we're told there is no alternative. Shortcut, TINA. TINA rules our world because capitalism is the only solution. In fact, neoliberal capitalism is the only solution. Measuring, downsizing, outsourcing is the only solution. There's only one solution politically, only one solution ecologically, only one solution economically and socially. And today, we want to talk about the alternatives. We want to talk about what theoretical alternatives are there to this one story, and also what practical alternatives. So the structure of the morning is as follows. The three guests will tell you what they think the most important issue is today. Then we will have a discussion amongst the three of them about the problem, about the alternatives, and also about the practical, actionable solutions that we might be able to take. And at the School of Life, we want to do this interactively. And so we would like your help as well. And your help today is not going to consist of asking us questions, but in fact, we're going to ask you a question. So after about an hour, I will come and ask you a question. The question we'll have to do is, what do you think the most important thing is that we need to do? I'll ask you to discuss this in pairs after what you've heard from our speakers, and then to write it on a card, and we'll take the cards home, and we'll tell you the result. So that's how we want to use you as one great think tank, and we want to know what you think about the issue as well. In the last 15 minutes, we will conclude with the three speakers wrapping up and giving us the conclusion and a call to action. So, to help us think through the alternatives, to help us talk about the alternatives, I will introduce them once they've sat down, but please welcome Naomi Klein, Srećko Horvat, and Joris Luyendijk. Great, so in terms of the introduction of our speakers today, Naomi Klein is an investigative journalist. She's one of the thought leaders. She burst on the scene in 1999 with a book called No Logo, which was to do with branding and the consciousness of branding. The next book was The Shock Doctrine, about the use of shock for political change. And then a book about the climate, entitled This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. And in her recent book, she tied these three elements, branding, shock doctrine, and the climate together. The new book is entitled No Is Not Enough, Resisting the New Shock Politics and Winning the World We Need. Naomi Klein is a correspondent for The Intercept. She writes for The Nation. She's published in The Guardian, The New York Times, Le Monde, The New Yorker. And in terms of her activism, she's also a board member of 350.org, Post-Fossil Fuels, Sustainable World, and she's the co-author and co-founder of the Leap Manifesto. Naomi Klein.
Thank you.
The next person is Srećko Horvat. He is a Croatian philosopher, an author, and also a political activist. He combines theory and praxis. And the theory, because he writes quite a lot of books, more than 10 or even 12 at the moment. 3 are available in English. What Does Europe Want? The Union and Its Discontents, co-written with Sławoslaw Žižek. He has a book on the radicality of love in 2015. And there's a book of interviews with him called Advancing Conversations about Subversion. So apart from his writing, he is the co-founder of the DM25 movement, and DM stands for Democracy in Europe movement, which is a transnational party, and he will tell us more about it.
It's not a party yet.
Oh, very good. It's a transnational movement. And he's been the organizer of all kinds of festivals and get-togethers for a different kind of alternative voice and an alternative argument. Srećko Horvat. And last but not least, Joris Luyendijk, who I'm very grateful that he came at very short notice to replace Yanis Varoufakis. Perhaps he's the person you would know best, since he's actually a Dutch person. He's lived in England for 6 years, and he's just moved back. Joris Luyendijk is a journalist, an author. He's lived in Egypt, Lebanon, the Palestinian territories, and in Britain for the last 6 years. He's written a number of books which have had a very high impact. The first one is Een goede man slaat soms zijn vrouw, which in English we would transliterate as a good man sometimes beats his wife, which was what his Egyptian female students told him about marriage, and it was one of the ways to change our perception of how the world thinks about things. 2006, Het zijn net mensen, beelden uit het Midden-Oosten, and the English title of that book is People Like Us, Misrepresenting the Middle East. The book that had the highest impact here in the Netherlands was his analysis of the crisis, and especially the banking world. And the title in Dutch is Dit kan niet waar zijn. In English, it's translated also quite fittingly as Swimming with Sharks. But his newest project, and the book that came out at the beginning of the year, and it's also an engagement politically, is Kunnen we praten, which in English is Can we talk? And it's an attempt to get out of the bubble of the people who think like him. It's an attempt to see how we can have a discussion and a dialogue in a post-truth world. So ladies and gentlemen, Joris Luyendijk. So to get us started off, my question would be, what do you think the most important, the most pressing issue is? And we'll give you a few minutes each to set the stage, as it were, for us and give us your contribution. And could I start with you, Naomi?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. And welcome all of you. Thanks for sharing your weekend with us. You know, Karim, I think you know from this latest book that one of my least favorite things is playing my crisis is bigger than your crisis. I think it's actually a really dangerous game to rank the relative crises we face, because I think we are in a moment of intersecting and overlapping crises, whether it's the threat of nuclear war, certainly escalating militarism, mass migration, forced migration, climate change, racial injustice, gender injustice, and rising white supremacy around the world. And so, you know, if you are on the front, and economic inequality, let's add that, you know, and I'm sure I'm forgetting lots of other things. And if you are on the front lines of any one of these crises, it's really hard to see anything else, and nor should you. If it's your family that's being torn apart because of some draconian new immigration law, or if it's your brother who was just shot by police because he's black in the streets, then all of this is a 5-alarm fire. If it's your grandmother who can't afford life-saving medicine, and I think, you know, I'm part of the environmental movement, as you mentioned, and I believe in the environmental movement. One of the greatest mistakes we've made is playing my crisis is bigger than your crisis, and sort of this idea of like, well, first we'll save the planet, and then we'll worry about poverty and racism and the rest of it. And I think that's rightly understood by a great many people on this planet as a slight, as a sort of a point of view that can only be held by people who are very privileged. And I think it's why the environmental movement in most parts of Europe and North America is an overwhelmingly white middle-class movement, even though the people who are on the front lines of climate change and are most impacted are overwhelmingly poor and black and brown. So I'm not going to play the game. But I will say that climate change has a different relationship to time than other crises, in the sense that we, as a species, have procrastinated for so long when it comes to taking this crisis seriously, despite decades of intergovernmental meetings and pledges and talk about lowering emissions. In fact, they've steadily increased by more than 60% in the years that our governments have been meeting about lowering emissions. And so now we find ourselves right up against the wall, and we're basically out of time to take radical action when it comes to climate change. And by radical, I mean what the latest science is telling us is that the fossil fuel frontier has to close right now, which means that we can have a managed decline of the fossil fuel projects that are in production right now as we switch very rapidly to 100% renewable economies by well before mid-century, if we want a chance of meeting the targets that our own governments set in Paris 2 years ago, where they defined dangerous warming, catastrophic warming, as anything above 2 degrees Celsius. The road we're on right now with current best case scenarios, i.e. if every government does what they said they were going to do in Paris, and we know they're not, because Trump is in charge in the United States, but even if he wasn't, if you add up all those targets, it leads us to 4 to 6 degrees of warming, not to, it leads us to 3 to 4 degrees of warming, not 2 degrees. And so what we're seeing now is already very dangerous warming. We've warmed the globe by 1 degree Celsius, and this past summer and fall, and I'll just restrict to what we've seen in the hemisphere where I'm from, we've seen forest fires that in North America where the plume of smoke stretched from the Pacific to the Atlantic, the entire continent. And that barely made the news because Houston at that time was underwater because of one hurricane. A massive evacuation was taking place in Florida because of another hurricane. Puerto Rico, as we know, still doesn't have power. And I think Puerto Rico is interesting because you see how all of these other crises intersect. A legacy of colonialism, militarism, the double standards of how a disaster is treated when the people who are impacted are Spanish-speaking, black and brown, as opposed to a predominantly white community. So I don't think we can pry these crises apart, but what I believe climate change does is it puts us on this firm and unyielding science-based deadline, and it tells us we need to embrace a model of change that is truly transformational. And I believe that's actually an opportunity to get other things right, to fight inequality, to fight colonialism, to repair, to honor our colonial debts in countries like yours and mine, to begin to heal deep, deep wounds. And I would say that the biggest obstacle we face is actually smug centrism. That is kind of repelled by the idea of rapid change, that prides itself on always sort of splitting the difference between the two extremes. And so I'm not going to spend my time bashing Trump in a crowd like this. I actually think we need to tackle that definition of safety, of centrism, which is actually incredibly dangerous right now in a moment where we're faced with the need for such deep change. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you very much. Very clear. Great. Srećko, what would you say the core issue, the core problem that we have to deal with?
Nothing more or less than the end of the world. Well, but I'm not joking. I will say something very similar to Naomi, just in different words and from a slightly philosophical point of view. Because if you look at 2017, just some of the events Naomi already mentioned, but let's just go back for a second. It all started with Donald Trump starting to be the president of the United States. In the meantime, the refugee crisis in the European Union was going on. Yemen was still bombed. Today we can see cholera in Yemen again. Then we saw during summer the biggest amount of wildfires from Canada to Croatia. We saw hurricanes, the possibility of global ecological disaster. With the recent Czech, Austrian, and German elections, we saw the insurgents not only of right-wing extremist parties, but actually of the possibility of having more autocratic regimes in Europe, except Turkey and Hungary, for instance. So what we have here is precisely, maybe for the first time in recent history, that we have a sense that the end of the world is coming. You could have seen it already before Trump became president, for instance, in the New Yorker, where a nice article was published about the doomsday preparations for the super rich, where you have people such as Peter Thiel getting the citizenship in New Zealand, or Elon Musk, you know, dreaming about the colonization of Mars. Why? Because all of them, the super rich, are aware that the world is going to end. But what I want to offer here today is a slightly different perspective, which comes from a kind of Balkan reading of the Apocalypse, which was influenced, well, we had it many times there, of course, so we know what we are talking about. And it comes from my good friend from the Lacanian School of Philosophy, Alenka Zupancic, who recently discovered a wonderful text under the ingenious title by a French philosopher, Maurice Blanchot, called "The Apocalypse is Disappointing." I don't know if there ever was a better title concerning the apocalypse, but let me tell you what it means and finish by that, because it actually brings us to some sort of hope and a possible answer to this end of the world which is in front of our eyes developing. So Blanchot wrote this text in 1964, which is, as if you like movies, you will remember this was the year when Kubrick shot Dr. Strangelove, and the short text, Apocalypse is Disappointing, is precisely about the bomb with the big B. And Blanchot is putting forward the following thesis, which I think holds true even more today, when there is not only the threat of the bomb, but the threat of an ecological disaster, the threat of a permanent state of exception, and so on. What Blanchot said is that with the bomb, in the 60s, but I claim that it holds true even today, it is for the first time that humanity as such got the conception of itself as a whole, as a totality. Because if the bomb goes, you know, Donald Trump puts a tweet and we have a nuclear war, all of us will be fucked. You know, it's not only someone here in Amsterdam or someone in Croatia, the whole world will disappear. So why is the apocalypse disappointing from Blanchot's point of view? It is disappointing because we will lose something, this whole, which we still didn't succeed to build. You know, and this is why Alenka Zupancic said that for the first time, the perception of the whole, of the totality of humanity, of something which might be a global community, comes through pure negativity, through something which we might lose. And why is this something which might give us hope? Because I think the only way we can stop something which seems inevitable today, with all these signs from the future, with Donald Trump, to Orban, to Kurz in Austria, to everything what is happening in the world, the only way we can stop something which seems inevitable today is to build today something which we might lose tomorrow. Which means that for the first time what we have to be aiming at, and that's something what Naomi is doing with Leap in Canada, what we are trying to do with DM25 in Europe, is to create for the first time something which would be a global community. So not only, I mean, the first step is of course to create a radical internationalism, a new global internationalist movement across nation states and borders. And this should be a step towards building a global community. So in that sense, the only way the apocalypse will not be disappointing is if we are able to succeed to build the totality and the whole of the global community which we are about to lose. Thanks a lot.
Great, so wonderful. So you've given us the issues and also already the kind of an advance notice of what you think the direction it could go in. And so this is also my invitation to Joris. What do you think the main topic is, and also perhaps you know, what would be a suggestion from your side, please?
Well, yeah, thank you very much for having me. And sorry, I'm not Yanis Varoufakis. There's the hair is different. Yeah.
It's just different.
If I were Yanis Varoufakis, I'd be the richest man in the world, because I could tell people, you know, in 24 hours, you can have all this. Yeah, I really like the term smug centrism, because I think it's also killing my trade, journalism. Yes, as I was preparing for this talk, I did think, could I narrow all these crises down to a dichotomy, to a binary opposition? And perhaps influenced by the past 6 years in Britain, where I've followed the Brexit debate very closely. One of the terms that constantly came up in Britain was the global race. And I think this brought me back to the only Dutch philosopher worth reading, Johan Huizinga, who created this dichotomy between competition and play as the overriding and governing principle of society. And so play is inherently non-competitive, and it's its own reward. Whereas competition is an activity whose reward lies outside of itself. It's external. And so competition brings out many, I think, human qualities that can be harnessed to positive ends, but often end up in a zero-sum game, because either I win or you win. And so I think one of the reasons that Britain voted to leave the EU, because its political culture, as it's been shaped in the past 30, 40 years by billionaire-owned newspapers, is that the world is a zero-sum game. And this then brought me to the idea, perhaps underlying all the crises we're witnessing is, on the one hand, competitive social Darwinism, and on the other hand, solidarity. And so underlying solidarity is, of course, empathy. And as you know, the behaviorists and psychologists tell us, the first thing that goes when you're fearful is empathy. So I would also, on a just tactical level, go really easy on the Titanic, the apocalypse, all these things. In the 80s, when Granddad grew up, I remember thinking the end of the world was nigh because of the nuclear standoff. And so I think it can be paralyzing to use these very big terms. And once you realize that fear leads either to paralysis or the shutdown of empathy, we may not want to go down that road. And so you mentioned this little project I did talking to populist voters, so both in Britain and here. And what struck me is that essentially how they read the promise of Wilders, Brexit, Trump is, I will protect you. I think this is why the wall is such a brilliant thing. And I think it need not even be built. It's the idea of we will fend you off on everything that makes you afraid. And similarly, we will fend you off from those Europeans. We have an island, we can shut the ports, close that terrible channel train link, and then it's just us. So I think if we would go down, if we would try to forge that global community informed by solidarity, I think we have to do two things. We have, on the one hand, find a way to reconnect with the fears of all those who vote for the social Darwinists, who essentially vote for their enemies. And on the other hand, and this is perhaps informed by my own background as an anthropologist, the definition of a community is not what it is, but who doesn't belong to the community. So if we really want to build a global community, we're going to do something that has never been done in humanity before, which is to create a community without others. And I think we have very good reasons not to want to create others, because if you go down, if you look at the catastrophes of the past few hundred years with nationalism and ethnicism, that is exactly what got us into all those wars and wholesale destruction of peoples. But it hasn't been done. So I'm not a philosopher, so I can just end on I don't know.
Okay. So thank you very much for these three very good setting the stage. This idea that all the crises are interrelated, but the ecological crisis has a certain kind of urgency, which perhaps puts it at the center, but also, or is also the focus for the other crises being dealt with together. Srećko, with this idea of the end of the world, and how do we then build a movement which makes the positive world before we destroy it through negativity. And Joris, with your idea of zero-sum, so competition versus collaboration or play, Homo Ludens, the book by Huizinga. And this idea that the fear is what makes the other. How do we build a community which doesn't include the other? So in terms of the question, or perhaps already the alternative, Perhaps we could talk a little bit about the Leap Manifesto, which is bringing together people in dialogue. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the movement that you're proposing, how it brings together political and democratic behavior. Perhaps Joris can enlighten us also a little bit about this difficulty of building a community with no other outside. How do you define yourself when you're not defining yourself against somebody else? But of course, please, you could also discuss this amongst yourselves. So, who would like to go first? Perhaps, Naomi, you could tell us a little bit about this idea of the Leap Manifesto and the dialogue. How do you bring people together who have different things at stake?
Sure. Can I just comment on a couple of things? One question I have for you, and maybe you can take this up in your go-around, but because of you've done such amazing work about the financial sector and bankers. I'm interested in the there is a class of people who have othered themselves, as, in a sense, are living lives of such privilege and wealth that they. In some cases, see themselves as outside the narrative of collective humanity. I make the argument that, within the Trump administration, you have people who openly deny climate change, and people like Rex Tillerson or Ivanka Trump who say that it's happening, right? But what they all agree on is that we shouldn't do anything about it, whether it's happening or not, right? And what I would argue is that even if they're not explicit about it, it's because they believe they will be safe, that they and their children will be safe. On the other hand, I mean, one of the interesting things that has happened in North America is the emergence of a figure like Bernie Sanders, self-described democratic socialist who got 13 million votes in the U.S. primary, which defied pretty much everybody's expectations, including his own. But Bernie had another, and that was the bankers. So I'm interested in whether you think that is possible without actually confronting power, and I just honestly don't know. I think there are ways of doing it that are not that are depersonalized and are not about the vilifying individuals. But I'm not sure it can be done without confronting power, which is certainly experienced and metabolized by elites as a personal attack. And then on the question of apocalypse, one of the things I've been challenged about recently, and there's a growing discourse on this, is, apocalypse depends on your perspective. And you mentioned that in the Balkans you've lived through it. A lot of indigenous writers in the Americas now talk about being in a post-apocalyptic phase, that the apocalypse happened to them already. Their worlds were destroyed, and they're in a process of reconstruction and revitalization. But even the idea that we're waiting for some apocalypse is a sort of a privileged position, because a lot of people are already beyond it. If you're Palestinian, you're in the post-Nakba, the post-catastrophe, the post-apocalypse, right? So, yeah, that's, I think, an interesting challenge to the whole apocalyptic narrative that is worth considering. So, yeah, the Leap Manifesto is something that I was part of building in Canada, and it's now been spreading around the world, Australia, and particularly in post-Trump U.S., not that we're post-Trump, but we're trying to get there. But it came actually out of realizing, we were in the middle of an election campaign a couple of years ago, and there was a lot of momentum towards getting rid of a right-wing government, the government of Stephen Harper, that had been in power for 9 years. But all of the parties that had a chance of winning that election, whether it was our centrist Liberal Party or our third party, the New Democratic Party, who are Social Democrats, they they had policies on the table that we felt, particularly on climate change, but also on indigenous rights and economic inequality, were really inadequate, that didn't meet the moment. So we helped convene a gathering of 60 movement leaders from labor, climate, food justice, indigenous rights, migrant rights, and we hosted this 2-day meeting where we tried to dream together, really. We realized that this was the first time that our movements had come together in a space that was not a space of no, a space of opposition. So we had all been part of coalitions, for instance, against a free trade agreement that we didn't like, or a terrible austerity bill, something like that. But the task we assigned for ourselves was actually finding our common ground for the world, to map the world after we win. And it was some of the most difficult work I've ever done. You know, you had people coming into that space with a lot of very difficult history. So you had a union leader representing workers in the Alberta tar sands, oil workers coming face to face with an very respected indigenous leader who is opposing a pipeline coming through his territory where some of those workers would get jobs. And I think because it wasn't a public gathering, there were some of the most honest exchanges I've ever seen. You know, it wasn't panels. It was actually, we kept it to a size where people could be face to face and could exchange. And we tried to come up with these common themes. And we realized actually just how rusty we are when it comes to you know, thinking about what the world feels like, looks like, what the experience of life is after we win. And so we had a great moderator who sort of walked us through this process where we imagined what our cities would feel like, you know, how it would address the epidemic of despair and isolation, disconnection, found connections between what you know, advocates working on homelessness and joblessness were experiencing in terms of this economic model that sort of just took to the breaking point from workers' bodies, from the social safety net, and finding common ground between that and our relationship to the planet itself, which is fundamentally extractive. So one of the really common things that came out was that we have this economic system that is based on taking without limit, taking as if there's no consequence. And it is pushing people to the breaking point, and it is pushing the planet to the breaking point. And that when we talked about the world that we wanted instead, it was really about this culture of caretaking, where we, yes, we take, but we also take care. And so a lot of what we came up with had to do with lifting up the professions, the work of caretaking, of land protection. And I'm struck by this idea of protection, right? Because I think there's two different kinds of protection. There's this passive, very patriarchal model of protection. I will protect you, passive person. You know, I am your protector, and it's also kind of a military model of protection. But then there's this other model of protection that's much more active, you know, it was. One of the really amazing things that has happened in North America in the past couple of years is this uprising in Standing Rock, North Dakota, against the Dakota Access Pipeline, led by indigenous people who have said from day one, we are not protesters, we're water protectors. And it was this paradigm shift where they forced the media to refer to them as protectors, right? And then you had veterans.
So from protesters to protectors.
Yeah,
so it's
protectors
framing the
water.
new language.
Yes.
It's making sure that people refer to you with the language that you've chosen for yourself as well.
And there was something so resonant about that word that people got instantly, and also so people and it was women-led, protectors of the water, protectors of the land, protectors of the air, but protectors of the systems that protect us. So it's a reciprocal system of protection, right? And a very active system of protection, which everybody is invited into. And then layered on top of that, there was this moment where thousands of veterans, of soldiers, former soldiers, came to protect the protectors when they were facing massive repression. So I think this idea of everybody stepping up in this role of protector with humility and understanding that we're actually protecting the systems that protect us in this cycle of protection, I think is very rich as a potential paradigm shift. I don't think we should leave it to the right.
So thank you. So in terms of, I'll give the floor to Srećko in a second, in sense of this idea of a community of what we stand for as opposed to a community of what we're against, or a community that includes everybody and that has no others outside. Going from the no is not enough, we have to find a way to say yes. We have to move from a reactive or a passive or a disempowered stage to an active and a proactive and a protector position. And also, in a certain sense, we have to create the words or find the words or appropriate the words that we feel that belong to us, that we also are not being put in a position through the words that others choose for us. And so you described also that process of meeting with all these people from different and sometimes conflicting stakeholders, and also finding a way to dialogue, finding a way to be honest, to be, and also to come up with that new identity and that new kind of agenda or whatever. Srećko, how does it resonate with you and the idea of starting a movement for democracy in Europe and the project that you're so personally engaged in?
Well, I'll do the same as Naomi. I'll first continue on something what she said before I come to DiEM25. Because I think what Naomi just said, that the apocalypse depends on the perspective, this is, I think, the first thing which we have to be aware when we talk about the apocalypse. And there is a beautiful science fiction TV series which shows what this means. I don't know how many of you here in the room watched The Leftovers, which is a beautiful series about the following hypothesis, that at one sudden moment, 2% of the whole population of the world disappear. 2%. And this means that 2% of this room would also disappear, that everyone has someone who is lost, and no one knows what happens. And then you have, sorry for the spoiler, but it's still worth watching it, 4 seasons of the series, which precisely shows the biggest problem of that so-called apocalyptic narrative, where on the one hand you have something what in psychoanalysis we would call fetishist denial, like in the sense we know very well that the apocalypse is happening, but still we are driving our big cars, we are leaving carbon footprint and so on, or we cannot do anything because we are just single, small individuals and so on. And on the other hand, you have something what I would call apocalyptic fetishism, in the sense what we have seen with the super rich, mainly white male from Silicon Valley. In the sense we know very well that the apocalypse is coming, so we are preparing for it. So you have all of this in the series, and here comes the spoiler, but the beautiful point comes at the very end of the series, where one of the protagonists of the series realizes that there is another parallel reality where 98% of the population disappeared. So it's an even bigger mess up. It brings me to our real-time dystopia today. Isn't the same happening, for instance, with the refugee crisis today, you know? We all live in parallel realities. Like 10 days ago, I was still swimming in the Adriatic Sea, while at the same time, on another corner of the same sea, Syrian refugees are drowning. Or you can see it, you don't have to go into those radicalities. You can go to any metro station or Hauptbahnhof in Germany, for instance, to see that we are currently constantly living in parallel realities. And here I come to something which I think is really necessary, what the very title of Naomi Klein's new book shows, is that we have to make this big leap from the no to the yes. Unfortunately, what we can see today is, you know, Hollywood is always the best test for our own reality. If you just look at the recent movies or the series which we have seen in the last 2 years, you will see that it's full of the no, full of the dystopia in the sense, without a clear yes or utopia. You had, okay, The Leftovers, then you had The Man in High Castle, where the fascists still are ruling United States and the whole world. Then you had Handmaid's Tale about the totalitarian system in the United States, where remarkably Canada, the same as in It Can't Happen Here, is the place of the refuge, which I think, of course, is a lie because there is no refuge.
Don't give away all the plots of all the series.
Yeah, I
all
will
the
not.
films.
But it's interesting. I will give you more movies just to finish with this. Because I think that's the way people can relate to something which is not just science fiction. What worries me, as someone who loves, obviously, as you can see, science fiction, is that 90% of the current science fiction are dystopias. If you look at the new Star Trek, sorry, I have to reveal the plot, you will see, because this is a scandal, I think, this is something which is new, I think, that the new Star Trek is not anymore about discovering. You know, someone who was supposed to be here, Yanis Varoufakis, would say that Star Trek is about the utopian future society, which is very similar to communism, you know. Everyone is equal, and what humans do instead of leading wars, they're discovering the universe, you know. In the new Star Trek, you have a ship which is called Discovery, but Discovery is not discovering, it is on a military mission. Sorry for another plot, but I think this is important because if you see what happened in October, for instance, I still remember because I was driving from the Adriatic Sea through the Croatian mountains, and in the evening in the Croatian mountains, there was a radio show announcing one of the biggest astronomical explorations in recent human history. And I was amazed. I don't know how many of you probably you heard about it. If you didn't, you were probably occupied by by Dutch politics. I came from Denmark as well, so I'm a bit confused. That two neutron stars collided, and it is for the first time that something like that was revealed, that it was perceived by the astronomers all around the world, and that they created a huge amount of gold and platinum, unfortunately 130 million years ago. But what I want to say is that instead of going in that direction, instead of discovering the universe, instead of discovering something which is really a metaphysical insight of the meaning of the world, what we are doing is precisely the same as the new Star Trek, which is instead of discovery, we are leading wars, we are ruining the planet instead of doing that.
Yes. Tell us a little bit about what your movement is and how you organize that. Naomi told us a little bit about Leap. Yeah.
Yeah.
Terrible salesman.
Yes. So,
we need
also
less Zizek, more Yanis.
Yes.
No. I'm Hegelian here. I think we need a dialectics.
But also in terms
to imagine Yanis and Zizek in the same person, that's...
But also in terms of our own habits, right? We're so... it's so easy to, when we write a book, to spend 10 chapters about analyzing the problems and saying what's wrong with it, and then the last 1 or 2 about what we would like to come up with a solution. In all of us, we need to make the shift from the critical stuff that we were trained in as philosophers, as thinkers, instead of saying why the other person's wrong or deconstruct or criticize the structures that are in front of us, what is the alternative structure that we want to build? And then it's a lot more vulnerable because then people can criticize us, right? You've come up with a proposal and then you're on the scene, you're on stage. So tell us a little bit about what is DM25?
Okay, to be very short, DM is an answer to what I just described, yes. To this dystopia we are witnessing today, which is new autocratic systems all around Europe.
Yeah,
which
is
Europe.
I'm
coming there,
it?
if you give me a second. Yeah. Because I still didn't mention Brexit, for instance, which is also part of this. I didn't mention the disintegration of Europe. I know very well that we need a yes, but before we come to the yes, we have to analyze the situation. This is what Naomi has done in her books until now, and now she's proposing a yes. So we first have to analyze the situation. What the DM is trying to do, well, it's connected, I would say, to the last 15 years of experience of struggles. Let me be analytical again, sorry. In 2001, there was something created in Porto Alegre which was called the World Social Forum, with the aim to connect all the progressive movements all around the world, transpassing, going across national identities or typical classical party politics. That lasted 10 years, this big experiment. It still exists, but unfortunately, since the World Social Forum in Dakar in Senegal, we witnessed, unfortunately, a decline of this experience, especially if you look at the map of Latin America. Then after that, what did you have as a response to the financial crisis 2007-2008? You had the Occupy movement 2011, from Syntagma Square to Puerta del Sol, from Tahrir to Occupy Wall Street, and then after that, which is the third paradigm, I would say, you had something which out of this horizontality went into verticality. You had the foundation of new political parties such as Syriza in Greece. That was 2015. Where we are today, and this is the reason why we have DiEM25, is that we can see, obviously, that all these three models of political action are not enough. Protest is not enough. Classical political parties are not enough. To have alter summits, such as the one which happened at the G20, where I happened to be in Hamburg this summer, also is not enough. So what we are trying to do at DiEM is to combine all these three levels. On the one hand, radical internationalism. On the other hand, horizontality, which means having a direct democratic movement all around Europe, also in states which are not member states. And now, at the moment, as we speak, we are discussing inside of DiEM, which already has 70,000 members, what we call verticality. Whether DiEM should have an electoral wing, and whether DiEM should think of contesting the European elections in 2019. You can ask me why if I don't believe in the European Parliament, but I can speak about that a bit later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I very much like this idea, indeed, of how do you go into a new paradigm of a movement where you question the horizontality, so that is everybody who's involved and the fact that everybody speaks equally, and then we take as much time as necessary to discuss, and then the verticality, which is how do we organize it in terms of positions of power and hierarchy, while we're very aware that we're doing it. So who becomes the spokesperson for this thing? Who becomes the representative? And also we might need to find new words, because maybe representative is the old system, maybe spokesperson is the old system, right? So there's very much in the sense of the difficulty I see in even describing a movement that you're creating, because again, you have to find the language and the description for it, and make sure that you're not being forced to use the language of the system, the very system that you're trying to find an alternative for. So thank you very much. Joris, from your perspective, from your study on the banks, from your study about going outside of the bubble, from your, what struck me very much in your description in your new book is that you say, when I talked about the banks, everybody talked about the rest of society and about this disempowerment and this sense that we're being forced to do things that we don't want, and then we react very angrily by just kind of killing off whatever project the people who enslave us or who have power over us have. How can you come out of that dynamic?
Yeah, thank you very much. Really inspiring points, by the way. I'd like to come back to some of them. It's the slogan that won the Brexit referendum was "Take back control," I think that was no coincidence. I mean, there were some really shrewd, bordering psychopathic people who have incredible insight in how to manipulate people and ordinary voters. So that was I think there's this sense, I think also really driven by technological change, which is not contested. It's just, when Google introduces Google Glass, it fails because consumers don't want it. But we don't even have a collective national or international conversation on what kind of technological endgame we want. If you just look at what Silicon Valley has done to social relations on every imaginable level, even going to secondary school now, brugklas, is completely different, because there's no longer a social dynamic at play, because as soon as people have their breaks, they get on their phones, which is very different from how I remember first year secondary school, which is you're thrown into all these new people. So it affects literally everything, and yet politics has stayed away. Oh no, we don't want to obstruct innovation. And then there's globalization, where increasingly politicians, mainstream politicians, tell voters not, I will protect you, but I will help you compete in the global marketplace. Well, that's very nice, if you're part of the sort of white, male, straight, middle class, university-trained elite, to tell other people who have very few options, I'm going to help you compete against hordes and hordes of people who you have very one-dimensional ideas of thanks to television representation. So I think this is a big thing, this idea of taking back control. And since the progressive left has really thrown in its lot mainstream with the neoliberals, this marriage of liberals and neoliberals means that the liberals really have lost the language to talk about solidarity, for example, because that would be the basis on why you protect them. Just coming back to quickly on Srećko, I think these dystopians, it's not only Hollywood, it's also really teen novels. Hunger Games, that sort of thing. There was a really interesting interview with Macron in Der Spiegel, where he says, I think we've really made a mistake in embracing postmodernism. Because what postmodernism does, it destroys any great narrative. And I think this is the reason why ecological disaster is so attractive, because it can't be deconstructed. Any other narrative on social cohesion, I'm sure I'll find some sort of hidden Foucaultian power structure that you're actually either ignoring because you're stupid or you're secretly serving. So I think this dystopia and postmodernism are really related. About the bankers, Naomi's point, I think individually bankers, struck me, they want to compete. You can pay them in coconuts, provided you pay all of them in coconuts. I interviewed a lot of compensation consultants, and they said, bankers really aren't interested in money. It's their bonus marks their place in the hierarchy. And so the first question asked by a banker who's given a bonus by a senior banker, what are the others getting? Which is a sackable offense to reveal your bonus. So it's this very, anthropologically absolutely fascinating, deeply dysfunctional world where people compete over a hierarchy that can't be made explicit. That is, I think, the individual drive. In terms of confronting entrenched interests, I think here the difficulty is that one is neoliberalization, and so we continue to seek out individual solutions to collective problems. So we're going to say, well, as long as people don't switch banks, then yeah, what can we do? Consumers have to switch banks. But the trouble is, of course, if I'm going to think like a neoliberal, I'm going to think if everybody takes this trouble of switching banks, then I don't have to do it because the problem is solved. Whereas if I'm the only one switching banks, nothing changes. It's like, why would I join that demonstration? It's already happening. Or I'm not going to protest the streets alone with a sign. There you need a collective solution. But neoliberalism, 40 years of it, has really undermined any kind of faith. When I was doing my tour about the book, constantly people would ask, how do I protect my savings? And the question was very rarely, how do we protect our savings? Individual solution to collective problem. This is the Hunger Games. Is again, in the Hunger Games, the overriding, deeply unjust system isn't challenged. We identify with the heroine as she navigates that system and tries to survive. And that, I think, is very much how politics these days is presented. And so we end up, it becomes this show business for ugly people. And this is why I think you called him Bernie. So since it's become show business, we address politicians now by their first name. Now, I cannot imagine Jimmy about Carter. I think there's a sense, Joop, Den Uyl. When politicians stand for something larger, you don't address them by their first name. Then they become like stars.
What about Jezza?
Jezza is a good one. Yeah.
Jezza is Jeremy Corbyn.
Jeremy Corbyn. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not just the first name, but it's the affectionate and also the kind of activist first name.
I'm not sure I agree, but we can come
yes,
back.
Yeah, let's come back. So then finally, about how to forge a community without othering. If we would look at the sort of best practices, the best one I could find was the welfare state, which wasn't really built on any kind of block formation. Although I think in Holland the welfare state was very much contrasted with America. There was this term Amerikaanse toestanden, which translates very difficultly. It's sort of American scenes, which was enough to kill off any attempt at eroding solidarity. No, then we'll end up with American scenes. And that term has disappeared, together with more and more American scenes. An increase in inequality, job insecurity, all that sort of thing. But I still think welfare state was forged on the basis of a positive drive, the idea that anyone holding Dutch citizenship should be entitled to a basic level, should be free from fear. But that comes, of course, so it's in anthropological terms, it's long-term reciprocity.
Right.
And the hard thing about long-term reciprocity is you need borders. Because as soon as you're going to open it up to immigration, for example, you have newcomers who are not in that long-term reciprocity contract. The same with internalization of the economy. When ING was still Postbank and its shareholders were Dutch and it got 90% of its turnover and profits in Holland, you could make an appeal to that bank. Right now, ING is active in God knows how many countries, and 90% of its shareholders are foreign. So there is no long-term reciprocity anymore between ING and Dutch society. It's now a purely legal relation. So this is why I continue to think that globalization delivered a number of benefits initially, just with the European project, and I think we're now beginning to see the long-term disadvantages of that system. And to come back to the banks, one reason we don't take on the banks, even had we found the political language to muster enough a political program, thanks to globalization, banks operate globally, whereas political entities operate regionally or nationally. So how do you take on JP Morgan?
Great. Thank you very much. A bit of a clapping. So in terms of the time also, I wondered if you could react to each other, and also what kind of examples of actions do we have that sound promising or that we're engaged in? You can come up with an action that you engaged in yourself, perhaps the action of talking to people from different parties, perhaps your own project. I would like to ask the audience in about 5 minutes and to ask them to talk to their neighbor about what they think the action is that we should take. But I think in terms of the analysis of the problem and a possible alternative, and a very challenging one, but also very interesting one in terms of this community based on yes, overcoming the contradiction that you've just sketched. So please react to each other, but briefly, and also if you could mention something that you think would be a good start.
Can I disagree, maybe, just for the sake of it, but not only for the sake of it? Well, I think this is precisely the problem when you speak about the welfare state, for instance. It's a nice system, we need more welfare state today and so on. Unfortunately, it is disintegrating. But I think any progressive, be it left or green, who today will advocate the welfare state as a sort of solution for today's problems is wrong. Why? Because I think the welfare state as such, at the very beginning, was a historical compromise between labor and work, as we know, but also today the situation completely changed. What I think today in relation to time and also to dystopia, utopia, what we need today, I think, is something what Karl Marx beautifully put in the 18th Brumaire, where he said that the revolution, the social revolution, the truly radical revolution, cannot draw its inspiration from the past, but has to draw its poetry from the future. So the welfare state, it's not the poetry from the future. What Thomas Piketty, for instance, you're an economist, is proposing with redistribution is nice, I think, but this is also not the poetry from the future. This is not solving the structural problem of global capitalism. I like that you mentioned Silicon Valley. Here I agree, because I think, what you can see with the universal basic income, and here I come to something very concrete, a concrete proposal from DM, which concerns the universal basic income, is something basically similar to the poetry from the past. Why are Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, and so on, all of them suddenly advocating the universal basic income? I think all of us should pose this question, and the answer is because they are very well aware that we are approaching a stage in global capitalism where we will have semi-full automation, and the question is what will happen with all those people who will not have a work. But what we at DM are, for instance, proposing, which brings us to the future, to something what we have to imagine, which is different than the systems which we had in the 20th century, is something what we, for instance, call the universal basic dividend. So that instead of taxation, you don't fund the universal basic income from taxation and the taxpayers' money, but you take it from the shares on capital. And I think this is a much more revolutionary idea than universal basic income. Or when it comes to redistribution, instead of pure redistribution, I think we have to change the very foundations of the system, that it would be impossible at all that someone has 100 times more than someone else. So these are the truly radical questions which brings us back to the poetry from the future.
Right. And in terms of... So thank you. Very, very concrete solutions. And also poetry from the future in terms of the dystopia. The science fiction dystopia is a poetry, but it's also only one kind of poetry. Naomi, do you...
Yeah. Yeah, and just to quickly add on the redistribution point, I think these battles between the left and the right over redistribution and how much redistribution there will be, for the most part, have taken for granted the idea that we can extract from the earth indefinitely, and then we're having a battle over the distribution of the spoils, right? And it's still a model that is based pretty much on infinite growth, and we've hit against the limits of that model. So I think we have to keep that in mind as well. You know, there really is no past perfect project that factored in the planet, really. So we are in uncharted territory, and that's frightening. And that doesn't mean that we can't learn from the past and the present, and there are certainly models that we can and must learn from, but I don't think there is anywhere where we can say, yes, they've figured it out. One point I would add around, I feel like absolutely control is central. This loss of control is central in the face of these remote forces, financial forces, political forces that the far right is tapping into. Another piece of it that I think we don't talk enough about is it has to do with isolation and disconnection. I think there's a crisis of disconnection, and part of that has to do with technology. And as you mentioned, you know, just that even when we're in each other's company, we're so often absent mentally. But we have multiple layers of disconnection from community, from nature, from social groupings, and we are social creatures, and that creates a crisis where we're simultaneously participating in our own disconnection in a kind of addictive cycle, and deeply longing for connection, which I think makes us ripe for demagogues who come in with these sort of cheap, you know, have a red baseball hat and make America great. Join this, you know, brands have been doing this for a long time, of sort of offering this surrogate connection, be part of this sort of corporate tribe. And now we have politicians who are doing the same thing very, very deftly. And so when we think about what our alternatives are, I think we talk about participation and how important participation is for democracy, but it isn't just for democracy. It's also about giving people, feeding this need, this deep, deep longing for connection. Because if that vacuum isn't addressed, it's going to be filled with cheap nationalism and ethno-chauvinism, and we are seeing how virally and quickly these movements can spread that are speaking to that desire to connect to something larger than ourselves, because there's nothing more human than it.
Right. And is there an example of a connection, however fledgling, however people are trying to do this, however grassroots, however even probably technological, that you have found in your travels, in your research, in your encounters with all these people?
So, I mean, I come to this, I should say that, most of my earlier work has been focused on the no, and, when I wrote the shock doctrine, I really did think that if people understood the way in which these cataclysmic crises are exploited, how our disorientation and panic is exploited to push through a very regressive agenda, if we had a language for it, then we would be able to resist it. And the shock doctrine came out in 2007. A few months later, the financial crisis hit, and we saw this wave of resistance, of naming it precisely for what it was. We won't pay for your crisis. This was the slogan all over Europe, and there was tremendous courage in saying no and coming together and rejecting the bill for this crisis created by the banks being offloaded onto the public. Right. But and really the title for this latest book really comes from this conversation I had with Alexis Tsipras before he was elected, where he actually said to me, no is enough, like in this moment, this is a moment of rejection. And I don't think that's true, because I think what neoliberalism has left us with is a profound fear of any future other than neoliberalism, right? And so we can't simply say no. We have to lay out a credible plan, and we have to bring people along in this journey, and so that there's collective ownership and belief that it is possible, and we need to build it in miniature, right, wherever we can. And I think we're seeing some really great examples of radical municipalism, of you know, like in Barcelona. I know right now what's going on in Barcelona is very different, but Ada Colau, the mayor of Barcelona, comes out of the housing rights movement. A few years ago, she was getting arrested for squatting buildings, and now she's been working for a couple of years now to turn Barcelona into a model of a different kind of city that is simultaneously open to refugees, that is fighting climate pollution, that is fighting gentrification and for affordable housing. I mean, not to say it's a utopia, but it is, I think, one of the most exciting things happening in the world right now. And there are some examples of this in North America, too, where since Trump has been elected, there have been a few cities in the South, Jackson, Mississippi, for instance, where a radical candidate for mayor, African-American, running with democratic workers' cooperatives at the center of his platform, was elected. One of the things I'm involved in right now is trying to support a plan for a people's reconstruction of Puerto Rico. Because as I mentioned earlier, you know, Puerto Rico brings together all of these intersecting crises, including a pending migration crisis, right? People are leaving the island because it's unlivable right now. And if the island is depopulated, everybody knows, then this is going to just become an opportunity for huge land grabbing of what's being called now climate gentrification, right? Very beautiful parts of the world are being cleared of their inconvenient poor inhabitants, and this becomes an opportunity to build second and third and fourth homes, golf resorts, luxury resorts, and so a coalition has come together of farmers fighting.
So there is a political path from being the outsider, the squatter, and also the community coming together to take political power and to take, or not just political power, but to put forward a political plan and a blueprint.
Entering into these moments of shock, right? These moments when
use the crisis and the shock as also as an opportunity for the people who've been displaced and for them to.
Well, and you know, these are moments where we really see the system laid bare, right? I mean, this is why they tell us all the time, don't talk about climate change. It's insensitive, you know, in the midst of a storm, right? But you know, if we think about the 2008 financial crisis and that the moment of openness, of political openness to other models, right? These are the moments where we absolutely must step in and say, here's the alternative, here's the plan, not a top-down approach, but really bringing people in. And so this is what's the problem is people are reeling, right? It's very, very hard to do because in a moment of true crisis, whether it's an economic crisis or whether you know, it's an ecological crisis or a war, people are so focused on their daily emergencies that it's very hard to get these initiatives underway. In Puerto Rico, people are so experienced with this because just in the past few years, they've experienced such a dramatic example of the shock doctrine with their debt crisis being used to put the island under emergency management, appointed emergency management. So everybody just knows that this crisis is going to be used to try to privatize what's left of their public services. So even as they're trying to get water, as they're trying to find housing, they're simultaneously organizing for a people's reconstruction of Puerto Rico that is better than what happened before the storm. So I think, you know, community-controlled renewable energy, you know, agroecological farming, participatory democracy, fighting colonialism, all that.
Okay, great. Joris, for you, the very ungrateful... No, sorry, no questions. No, I'm sorry, we can't have questions. You can talk to your neighbor in a second. I'm sorry, this is my role here. And no, you can't ask a question. And if you want, you can write it, and we'll make sure that she gets it afterwards. But we really, unfortunately, don't have the time. Joris, for you, the unenviable task to just come up with one or two examples of actions that you see before we ask the public.
Yeah, that's not very enviable.
My apologies.
No, but what I struggle, I was trying to think, why can't I think of any actions that are beyond the symbolic? And so there must be an impasse somewhere. And the two I came up with is, on one hand, scale. So I think that one of the strongest arguments in favor of Brexit was to say we need to shorten the chains of accountability. And so if you want to organize humanity on a global scale, that means that the scale is going to be vast. That interviewing people in these banks, you know, you're actually at JP Morgan in a little niche, and you're part of this huge chain. It's very difficult to feel ownership or even take responsibility because it's so entirely unclear what it is you actually do as part of that huge chain. On the other hand, you know, if you organize globally, there are huge economies of scale, but the diseconomies of scale. And so any action that doesn't address the problem on that scale seems empty or symbolic, but then the practicalities of building such a global thing immediately runs into such huge problems. The other one, I think, would be that the oppressed are no natural allies. Mm-hmm. And so, on a distributive level, if all of us were to share our wealth equitably, you know, this would be our last holiday ever. You know, there would be no journeys to the Croatian mountains anymore because you have used up your carbon footprint. All of us have. The same with socially. I mean, the one reason why I'm against further immigration from the Middle East is that I have lived there for 4 years. I've learned the language. I've done a lot of research, and I haven't run into anyone who thinks gay people and straight people are equal, who believe women and men are equal to entirely the same degree that they're here. And I don't think that just because you're going to give them a passport, they're going to raise their children to consider straight and gay people equally. So until we found a way of drilling those Enlightenment values into people's heads, I think we shouldn't have further immigration. Now, please don't. No, when you say this, you always get applause from the wrong corners. I didn't say you were the wrong corner, but it's such a fraught issue. Right. Also, ideologically, there are those who see the solution in self-correcting markets, who still believe in the Silicon Valley idea and the neoliberal idea that markets, once properly addressed, for example, with carbon pricing, they can self-correct and create stable equilibriums. There are others who think, no, we need a form of central planning. Again, there are no allies here. Mm-hmm. And so I think these are the two impasses. Now, I was called an economist. I am not an economist. I have actually studied something. I'm a religious anthropologist, and so I'm not a revolutionary. So I think poetry of the future sounds fantastic, but if I look at the revolutionaries in the past few hundred years, they always end up destroying the revolutionaries. Mm-hmm. And this is the final impasse for me, is that especially ecologically, the problems are so pressing that they call for radical change, but there are very few examples of successful radical change, especially not with untested political institutions, which you would need on a global level. Right. So I'm sorry not to be able to offer sort of the path forward to a glorious future. But here, this is where I'm stuck. And so, a religious anthropologist, religion has actually one of the most successful forms of long-term mutual reciprocity.
Right. Great. I wanted to ask the speakers in the last few minutes that we have together to give us their final thoughts and final views and final questions that they have. Naomi, could I start with you?
Sure. Well, one thought I had is just how important it is in finding a way forward to get in rooms filled with people who take us out of our comfort zone, you know, who... and get over yourself. You know, this has been a wonderful event, and it's been fantastic to take part in it, but I think we also need to be aware that the ticket price made it prohibitive for a lot of people who would have loved to have been here. And there are all kinds of barriers, you know, that are often invisible that keep people who would love to be in rooms together in conversation out of those rooms. So, you know, I think this has been the most gratifying part of being part of the LEAP process is getting people together in these rooms, you know, who don't look like each other, come from radically different backgrounds, and still being able to find some common ground, right? And that's a tremendous experience, and I hope that that we can do more of it. All of us get out of our comfort zones and find because we live in this moment of intersecting and overlapping crises, we can't focus on solutions that only solve one problem at a time. And we can't rank our crises, just coming back to what I started with. And so what we need are solutions that solve multiple problems at once. And so one of the things, for instance, that we came up with the LEAP was that as we take the science of climate change seriously and radically bring down our emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions, we want to build a fair economy. So we don't want to be getting our renewable energy from a handful of conglomerates. We want energy democracy. We want community-controlled renewable energy. We want energy cooperatives. And we also want energy reparations, which means that the people who've gotten the worst deal under our current dirty energy model need to be first in line to own and control their own renewable energy, whether it's indigenous communities, whether it is immigrant communities that have the dirty coal plants in their backyards. And we also, and I really also want to emphasize that I strongly believe that that path to the future begins with honest confrontation of our past, of our responsibilities, and I think this has a lot to do with migration policies. We have to confront the role that wealthy countries like the Netherlands, my own country, have played in fueling the drivers of migration, the role that a company like Shell has played in destabilizing the Middle East, the way that our own wealth comes from extracting wealth from poorer countries, and we need migration policies that represent that shared responsibility. Our pasts are intertwined, and so is our future.
Is there there's TED and then there's TEDx. Everybody can organize their own TED by putting a red spot in the middle and having a certain format. Is there a Leap X?
That's a good idea.
Is there a manifesto on how to, is there a blueprint on how to organize your own LEAP?
So I've talked about the LEAP a lot, and anybody who's interested in reading the manifesto, which is just 1,400 words, can go to theleap.org, but also get some tools for organizing your own local LEAP project. We've got, one of the most exciting things that's happened is that all of these local LEAP groups have formed, rewritten it to reflect the needs of their local communities, sort of taking the core principles and applying it. So yeah, we don't call it Leap X, but there are lots of examples of localizing the LEAP, or the living LEAP, as we call it.
The living LEAP, wonderful, thank you. Joris, your final thoughts.
So I was racking my brain for a source of optimism. I hang around bankers too much. Well, giving these talks about just how disastrous our financial system is forced me into coming up with some optimistic note to end with, because organizers would always ask me, there's drinks afterwards, so we don't want everyone to just go completely. And so the one is, it's just, I mean, it's right in front of us, it's women's rights. Because if you would go back 100 years and you would tell people how far we've come in 100 years, I think very few would have believed you. We're not there yet at all. Think of the guy with the red baseball cap making America great again. But it is enormous, and it reached even deeper into our sense of self as everything else we talked about. Because getting good laws on the books to reorganize finance and renewable energy is nothing compared to how you fundamentally have to rethink your own identity, if you're a woman or a man, in order to have full equality between men and women. And so if we can do this as human beings, and it's already become so ingrained and normal that you don't stop to think. But I lived in Egypt for a year at a university, and all the women told me they were inferior. Mm-hmm. And so that is amazing, and we've done that in 100 years. So I think while this backcasting, thinking, how will the world look like after we've won? That's a fantastic phrase. I think we will look back at this at the time when at least a number of dogmas have collapsed, especially the neoliberal ones, and we're now in this race against time, and we're going to win. Naomi just told us.
Right. So perhaps then building on the shock doctrine of the Me Too, not Me Too, I've been aggressed, but the Me Too, I'm taking control, or I'm protecting, Me Too, I'm also part of this, I'm also part of the leadership, I'm part of the solution, I'm part of the people in charge. Whether we can make that shift after the shock and the anger and the sadness and the openness of that first Me Too happens. Srećko, you have the last word. 2 minutes.
So no science fiction plot. But well, what I will say might sound as science fiction, but let's hope that together we can make it a reality. Let's fight for a world where no one has to pay a ticket for such events. Let's fight for a world where the organizer can take the money from whoever, even from the devil, but the tickets will be completely free. Let's fight for a world where a Q&A will be possible. I know sometimes it's not possible. Or to go a step further, let's fight for a world where these kinds of events are not even necessary. So Naomi can spend more time with her son, I can spend more time with my nephew, I can spend more time at my Adriatic island. Unfortunately, I think today it is true what Adolf Hitler said in 1939 in his famous Friedensrede, peace speech, where he said, "Es gibt keine Insel mehr." It doesn't sound like Hitler, but he would say it probably a bit even more aggressive. But he said there are no islands anymore. There is a ticket price, unfortunately, for this. There is no Q&A, unfortunately, because precisely there are no islands outside of capitalism anymore. And I think this is the first thing which we have to be aware, that there are no islands. It is not possible to escape. Even if you escape to Mars, you will find white male guys from Silicon Valley there. So, if we want to get out of this science fiction dystopia, I think the first thing which we have to do is to start from the local level, from the municipal level, and then to try to create a new international movement, which is already in the foundation today, from Canada to Europe, from Mexico with the Zapatistas to some parts of Africa. I think we have to be aware that we have to act on all levels, on the local level, national level, global level, on the horizontal level, and on the vertical level, and this is the only way we can get out of the current deadlock and post-apocalypse. Thanks a lot.
We can